Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 422nd Quidditch World Cup. The spectators screamed and clapped. Thousands of flags waved, adding their discordant national anthems to the racket. The huge blackboard opposite was wiped clear of its last message, which was Bertie Bott's every flavour beans, a risk with every mouthful, and now showed Bulgaria 0, Ireland 0. And now, without further ado, allow me to introduce the Bulgarian national team mascots. The right-hand side of the stands, which was a solid block of scarlet, roared its approval. "I wonder what they brought," said Mr. Weasley, leaning forward in his seat. "Ah!" He suddenly whipped off his glasses and polished them hurriedly with his robes. "Vila!" What a Vila! But 100 Vila were now gliding out onto the field, and Harry's question was answered for him. Vila were women, the most beautiful women Harry had ever seen. Except that they weren't. They couldn't be human. This puzzled Harry for a moment while he tried to guess what exactly they could be. What could make their skin shine moon bright like that? Or their white gold hair fan out behind them without wind? But then the music started, and Harry stopped worrying about them not being human. In fact, he stopped worrying about anything at all. The Vila had started to dance, and Harry's mind had gone completely and blissfully blank. All that mattered in the world was that he kept watching the Vila, because if they stopped dancing, terrible things would happen. And as the Vila danced faster and faster, wild, half-formed thoughts started chasing through Harry's dazed mind. He wanted to do something very impressive, right now. Jumping from the box into the stadium seemed a good idea. But would it be good enough?
Harry, what are you doing?
Said Hermione's voice from a long way off. The music stopped. Harry blinked. He was standing up, and one of his legs was resting on the wall of the box. Next to him, Ron was frozen in an attitude that looked as though he were about to dive from a springboard. Angry yells were filling the stadium. The crowd didn't want the Vila to go. Harry was with them. He would, of course, be supporting Bulgaria. And he wondered vaguely why he had a large green shamrock pinned to his chest. Ron, meanwhile, was absent-mindedly shredding the shamrocks on his hat. Mr. Weasley, smiling slightly, leaned over to Ron and tugged the hat out of his hands. "You'll be wanting that," he said, "once Ireland have had their say." "Huh?" said Ron, staring open-mouthed at the Vila, who had now lined up along one side of the field. Hermione made a loud tutting noise. She reached up and pulled Harry back into his seat. "Honestly," she said. "And now," roared Ludo Bagman's voice, "kindly put your wands in the air for the Irish national team mascots." Next moment, what seemed to be a great green and gold comet came zooming into the stadium. It did one circuit of the stadium and split into two smaller comets, each hurtling towards the goalposts. A rainbow arched suddenly across the field, connecting the two balls of light. The crowd oohed and ahed, as though at firework display. Now the rainbow faded and the balls of light reunited and merged. They'd formed a great shimmering shamrock, which rose up into the sky and began to soar over the stands. Something like golden rain seemed to be falling from it. "Excellent!" yelled Ron, as the shamrock soared over them, and heavy gold coins rained from it, bouncing off their heads and seats. Squinting up at the shamrock, Harry realised that it was actually comprised of thousands of tiny little bearded men with red vests, each carrying a minute lamp of gold or green. "Leprechauns!" said Mr. Weasley over the tumultuous applause of the crowd, many of whom were still fighting and rummaging under their seats to retrieve the gold. "There you go," Ron yelled happily, stuffing a fistful of gold coins into Harry's hand. "For the omnoculars. Now you got to buy me a Christmas present. Ah!" The great shamrock dissolved. The leprechauns drifted down onto the field on the opposite side from the Vila, and settled themselves cross-legged to watch the match. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, kindly welcome Bulgarian national Quidditch team. I give you Dimitrov. A scarlet-clad figure on a broomstick, moving so fast it was blurred, shot out onto the field from an entrance far below, to wild applause from the Bulgarian supporters. Ivanova! A second Scarlet Road player zoomed out. Zograf, Levski, Volchanov, Volkov, and Crumb. That's him! That's him! Yelled Ron, following Crumb with his omnoculars. Harry quickly focused his own. Victor Crumb was thin, dark, and sallow-skinned, with a large curved nose and thick black eyebrows. He looked like an overgrown bird of prey. It was hard to believe he was only 18. And now, please greet the Irish national Quidditch team, yelled Bagman. Presenting Connolly, Ryan, Troy, Mullet, Moran, Quigley, and Lynch. 7 green blurs swept onto the field. Harry spun a small dial on the side of his omnoculars and slowed the players down enough to read the word Firebolt on each of their brooms and see their names embroidered in silver upon their backs. And here, all the way from Egypt, our referee, acclaimed chair wizard of the International Association of Quidditch, Hassan Mustafa. The small skinny wizard, completely bald but with a moustache to rival Uncle Vernon's, wearing robes of pure gold to match the stadium, strode out onto the field, a silver whistle protruding from under the moustache, and he was carrying a large wooden crate under one arm, his broomstick under the other. Harry spun the speed dial on his omnoculars back to normal, watching closely as Mustafa mounted his broomstick and kicked the crate open. 4 balls burst into the air, the scarlet quaffle, the 2 black bludgers, and, Harry saw it for the briefest moment before it sped out of sight, the minuscule winged golden snitch. With a sharp blast on his whistle, Mustafa shot into the air after the balls. And they're off! Screamed Bagman. And it's Mullet, Troy, Moran, Dimitrov, back to Mullet, Troy, Levski, Moran. It was Quidditch, and Harry had never seen it played before. He was pressing his omnoculars so hard to his glasses they were cutting into the bridge of his nose. The speed of the players was incredible. The chasers were throwing the quaffle to one another so fast that Bagman only had time to say their names. Harry spun the slow dial on the right of his omnoculars again, pressed the play-by-play button on the top, and he was immediately watching in slow motion, while glittering purple lettering flashed across the lenses and the noise of the crowd pounded against his eardrums. Hawk's Head attacking formation, he read as he watched the 3 Irish chasers zoom closely together, Troy in the centre, slightly ahead of Mullet and Moran, bearing down upon the Bulgarians. Horskov Ploy flashed up next, as Troy made it as though to dart upwards with the quaffle, drawing away the Bulgarian chaser Ivanova, and dropping the quaffle to Moran. One of the Bulgarian beaters, Volkov, swung hard at a passing bludger with his small club, knocking it into Moran's path. Moran ducked to avoid the bludger and dropped the quaffle, and Levski, soaring beneath, caught it. Troy scores! Roared Bagman, and the stadium shuddered with a roar of applause and cheers. 10-0 to Ireland. What? Harry yelled, looking wildly around through his omnoculars. But Levski's got the quaffle. Harry, if you're not going to watch it at normal speed, you're going to miss things, shouted Hermione, who was dancing up and down, waving her arms in the air, while Troy did a lap of honour around the field. Harry looked quickly over the top of his omnoculars and saw the leprechauns watching from the sidelines had all risen into the air again and formed the great glittering shamrock. Across the field, the Vila were watching them sulkily. Furious with himself, Harry spun his speed dial back to normal as play resumed. Harry knew enough about Quidditch to see the Irish chasers were superb. They worked as a seamless team, their movements so well coordinated they appeared to be reading one another's minds as they positioned themselves, and the rosette on Harry's chest kept squeaking their names. Troy, Mullet, Moran. And within 10 minutes, Ireland had scored twice more, bringing their lead to 30-0 and causing a thunderous tide of roars and applause from the green-clad supporters. The match became still faster, but more brutal. Volkov and Volchanov, the Bulgarian beaters, were whacking the bludgers as fiercely as possible at the Irish chasers, and were starting to prevent them from using some of their best moves. Twice they were forced to scatter, and then, finally, Ivanoa managed to break through their ranks, dodge the keeper, Ryan, and score Bulgaria's first goal. "Fingers in your ears!" bellowed Mr. Weasley as the Vila started to dance in celebration. Harry screwed up his eyes too. He wanted to keep his mind on the game. After a few seconds, he chanced to glance at the field. The Vila had stopped dancing, and Bulgaria was again in possession of the quaffle. "Dimitrov, Levski, Dimitrov, Ivanoa, oh I say!" roared Bagman. 100,000 wizards gasped as the two seekers, Crumb and Lynch, plummeted through the centre of the chasers, so fast it looked as though they just jumped from airplanes without parachutes. Harry followed their descent through his omnoculars, squinting to see where the snitch was. "They're going to crash!" screamed Hermione next to Harry. She was half right. At the very last second, Victor Crumb pulled out of the dive and spiralled off. Lynch, however, hit the ground with a dull thud that could be heard throughout the stadium. A huge groan rose from the Irish seats. "Fool," moaned Mr. Weasley. "Crumb was fainting." It's time out!" yelled Bagman's voice. As trained Medi-Wizards hurry onto the field to examine Aidan Lynch. "He'll be okay. He only got ploughed," Charlie said reassuringly to Ginny, who was hanging over the side of the box, looking horror-struck. Which is what Crumb was after, of course. Harry hastily pressed the replay and play-by-play buttons on his omnoculars, twiddled the speed dial and put them back up to his eyes. He watched as Crumb and Lynch dived again in slow motion. "Wronski defensive feint. Dangerous seeker diversion," read the shining purple lettering across his lenses. He saw Crumb's face contorted with concentration as he pulled out of the dive just in time, while Lynch was flattened, and he understood Crumb hadn't seen the snitch at all. He was just making Lynch copy him. Harry had never seen anyone fly like that. Crumb hardly looked as though he was using a broomstick at all. He moved so easily through the air that he looked unsupported and weightless. Harry turned his omnoculars back to normal and focused them on Crumb. He was now circling high above Lynch, who was being revived by Medi-Wizards with cups of potion. Harry, focusing still more closely upon Crumb's face, saw his dark eyes darting all over the ground 100 feet below. He was using the time while Lynch was revived to look for the snitch without interference. Lynch got to his feet at last, to loud cheers from the green-clad supporters, mounted his firebolt and kicked back off into the air. His revival seemed to give Ireland a new heart. When Mustafa blew his whistle again, the chasers moved into action with a skill unrivalled by anything Harry had seen so far. After 15 more fast and furious minutes, Ireland had pulled ahead by 10 more goals. They were now leading by 130 points to 10, and the game was starting to get dirtier. As Mullet shot towards the goalpost yet again, clutching the quaffle tightly under her arm, the Bulgarian keeper, Zograf, flew out to meet her. Whatever happened was over so quickly, Harry didn't catch it, but a scream of rage from the Irish crowd and Mustafa's long, shrill whistle blast told him it'd been a foul. And Mustafa takes the Bulgarian keeper to task for cobbing, excessive use of elbows. Bagman informed the roaring spectators. And yes, it's a penalty to Ireland. The leprechauns, who'd risen angrily into the air like a swarm of glittering hornets when Mullet had been fouled, now darted together to form the words, "Ha ha ha." The Vila on the other side of the field leapt to their feet, tossed their hair angrily and started to dance again. As one, the Weasley boys and Harry stuffed their fingers into their ears, but Hermione, who hadn't bothered, was soon tugging on Harry's arm. He turned to look at her, and she pulled his fingers impatiently out of his ears. "Look at the referee," she said, giggling. Harry looked down at the field. Hassan Mustafa had landed right in front of the dancing Vila and was acting very oddly indeed. He was flexing his muscles and smoothing his moustache excitedly. "Now we can't have that," said Ludo Bagman, though he sounded highly amused. "Somebody slap the referee!" A Mediwizard came tearing across the field, his fingers stuffed into his own ears, and kicked Mustafa hard in the shins. Mustafa seemed to come to himself. Harry, watching through the binoculars again, saw that he looked exceptionally embarrassed and had started shouting at the Vila, who had stopped dancing and were looking mutinous. "And unless I'm much mistaken, Mustafa is actually attempting to send off the Bulgarian team mascots," said Bagman's voice. "Now there's something we haven't seen before. Oh, this could turn nasty." It did. The Bulgarian beaters, Volkov and Volchanov, landed on either side of Mustafa and began arguing furiously with him, gesticulating towards the leprechauns who had now gleefully formed the words, "he, he, he." Mustafa was not impressed by the Bulgarians' arguments, however. He was jabbing his fingers into the air, clearly telling them to get flying again. And when they refused, he gave 2 short blasts on his whistle. Two penalties for Ireland," shouted Bagman, and the Bulgarian crowd howled with anger. "And Volkov and Volchanov had better get back on those brooms. Yes, there they go. And Troy takes the quaffle." Play now reached a level of ferocity beyond anything they'd yet seen. The beaters on both sides were acting without mercy. Volkov and Volchanov, in particular, seemed not to care whether their clubs made contact with a bludger or human as they swung them violently through the air. Dimitrov shot straight at Moran, who had the quaffle, nearly knocking her off her broom. "Foul!" roared the Irish supporters as one, all standing up in a great wave of green. "Foul!" echoed Ludo Bagman's magically magnified voice. "Dimitrov skins Moran, deliberately flying to collide there. There's got to be another penalty. Yes, there's the whistle." The leprechauns had risen into the air again, and this time they formed a giant hand, which was making a very rude sign indeed at the Vila across the field. At this, the Vila lost control. Instead of dancing, they launched themselves across the field and began throwing what seemed to be handfuls of fire at the leprechauns. Watching through his binoculars, Harry saw they didn't look remotely beautiful now. On the contrary, their faces were elongated into sharp, cruel, beaked bird heads, and long, scaly wings were bursting from their shoulders. "And that, boys," yelled Mr. Weasley over the tumult of the crowd below, "is why you should never go for looks alone." Ministry wizards were flooding onto the field to separate the Vila and the leprechauns, but with little success. Meanwhile, the pitched battle below was nothing to the one taking place above. Harry turned this way and that, staring through his binoculars as the quaffle changed hands with the speed of a bullet. Levski, Dimitrov, Moran, Troy, Mullet, Ivanova, Moran again, Moran scores! But the cheers of the Irish supporters were barely heard over the shrieks of the Vila. The blast now issuing from the ministry members' wands and the furious roars of the Bulgarians. The game recommenced immediately. Now Levski had the quaffle, now Dimitrov. The Irish beater, Quigley, swung heavily at a passing bludger. It hit it as hard as possible towards Crumb, who did not duck quickly enough. It hit him full in the face. There was a deafening groan from the crowd. Crumb's nose looked broken. There was blood everywhere. But Hassan Mustafa didn't blow his whistle. He'd been distracted, and Harry couldn't blame him. One of the Vila had thrown a handful of fire and set his broom tail alight. Harry wanted someone to realise that Crumb was injured, even though he was supporting Ireland. Crumb was the most exciting player on the field. Ron obviously felt the same. "Time out! Oh, come on, he can't play like that! Look at him!" "Oh, look at Lynch!" Harry yelled. For the Irish seeker had suddenly gone into a dive, and Harry was quite sure this was no Wronski feint. This was the real thing. "He's seen the snitch!" Harry shouted. "He's seen it! Look at him go!" Half the crowd seemed to realise what was happening. The Irish supporters rose in another great wave of green, screaming their seeker on. But Crumb was now on his tail. How he could see where he was going, Harry had no idea. There were flecks of blood flying through the air behind him, but he was drawing level with Lynch as the pair of them hurtled towards the ground again. "They're going to crash!" shrieked Hermione. "They're not!" roared Ron. "Lynch is!" yelled Harry. And he was right. For the second time, Lynch hit the ground with tremendous force and was immediately stampeded by a horde of angry Veela. "The snitch! Where's the snitch?" bellowed Charlie along the road. "He's got it! Crumb's got it! It's all over!" shouted Harry. Crumb, his red robe shining with blood from his nose, was rising gently into the air, his fist held high, a glint of gold in his hand. The scoreboard was flashing Bulgaria 160, Ireland 170 across the crowd, who didn't seem to realise what had just happened. Then, slowly, as though a great jumbo jet were revving up, the rumbling from the Ireland supporters grew louder and louder and erupted into screams of delight. "Ireland wins!" Bagman shouted, who, like the Irish, seemed to be taken aback by the sudden end of the match. "Crumb gets the snitch, but Ireland wins. Good Lord, I don't think any of us were expecting that."